Welcome to World History Lesson 6. Ancient China. Our lesson objectives will be identify important characteristics and contributions made by the peoples of ancient China, identify geographic and political factors that help bring about the rise and fall of ruling families in China, identify key religious and philosophies that influence the development of the Chinese culture, identify and understand the similarities and differences of the people of ancient China to previously discussed civilizations. China is a huge country in Eastern Asia. India and China share a border, but the ancient Chinese had very little contact with the Indian civilization. As with India, China was isolated from the rest of Asia by mountains in the south and west, the Gobi Desert in the north, and the Yellow Sea in the northeast. The ancient Chinese believed their country was the center of the civilized world and called their homeland the Middle Kingdom. Early Chinese civilizations developed along the Yellow River Valley, which is also called the Huanghe River Valley. The Huanghe River, like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, deposits soil along its banks, making the region fertile and good for farming. The Huanghe River got its name from the loess or fine windblown yellow soil that settles to the river bottom and gives it a yellow color. Although this rich soil was suitable for farming, the many floods caused such destruction that China's Huanghe River came to be called China's Sorrow. Shang dynasty. China's first dynasty or ruling family was called the Shang. The Shang Empire was founded in the Huanghe Valley. Their walled capital city at Anyang had public buildings, shops, and areas for food storage. Unlike other ancient cities found in the Indus Valley or Fertile Crescent, Anyang was built mainly of wood. At the center was a palace and a temple, and vast earthen walls protected the city from invasion. During the Shang dynasty, society in China was controlled by a small upper class. The royal family and the warrior nobles were considered the highest social classes. Shang kings were both political and religious leaders and were believed to have the power to communicate with the gods. The nobility and other people of high birth lived in large timber or stone houses in the city. The noble families owned all the land and governed the villages and sent tribute to the Shang king in exchange for local control of their territories. The lower classes of peasant farmers, artisans, and slaves made up most of the population. They lived outside the city in farming villages. Farmers did not have plows and were forced to use only digging sticks and hoes to cultivate their land. Their chief crops were millet, a type of grain, rice, barley, wheat, and vegetables. They also raised silkworms and used the threads to make beautiful silk cloth. Life for the lower classes was harsh, as it was for many peasants in ancient civilizations. Long hours were spent working on the noble's land or repairing irrigation dikes. Discovery of silk. The silkworm, really the caterpillar form of a moth, has been producing silk for more than 4,000 years. The silkworm requires a diet of mulberry leaves and demands much attention. Chinese legend says the Empress Si-Ling Qi, wife of a king, discovered how to make silk fabric. While walking in her garden, she noticed strange cocoons in the limbs of a mulberry tree. She plucked the cocoon and found she could unravel it into a long thread-like fiber. The empress then gathered the fibers and spun them into a radiant piece of cloth. Silk quickly became a prized item of trade for ancient China. Determined to keep other civilizations from discovering how to make silk, the Chinese threatened anyone who told where silk was obtained with death. The Chinese held on to the secret of silk making for hundreds of years. Shang religion. The Shang were polytheistic and worshipped many gods and nature spirits. The Shang people believed that the gods controlled all things. They believed that prayer to one's ancestors was essential to influencing the gods. The Chinese called upon the spirits of their ancestors to bring good fortune to their family. Sacrifices and food offerings were made to honor one's ancestor spirits. Writing was developed for religious use. Priests wrote questions to the gods on oracle bones made of animal bones and tortoise shells and heated the bones until they cracked. The shape and position of the cracks were used to determine the god's answer. The writing on the oracle bones are the oldest examples of Chinese writing. The decline of the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty lasted for about 500 years. Over the course of time, the dynasty weakened because it lacked strong leaders. Little by little, powerful nobles gained control of Shang territories. Eventually, the Shang dynasty was overthrown by a dynasty known as the Zhou. The Zhou was a group of wandering herders from northwestern China. The Zhou overthrew the last Shang king and eventually adopted much of Shang culture. Writing, arts and crafts, and astronomy. Chinese civilization during this early period was very advanced. The Shang dynasty developed a system of writing that used thousands of picture symbols or pictograms to represent objects and ideas. The Shang produced beautiful pottery made from porcelain. They learned to weave silk cloth from the threads of silkworms and made finely embroidered silk shoes. Shang artists became famous for their bronze work. They used bronze to make small or large artistically designed objects used for religious practices. Weapons and massive cauldrons weighing about a ton were also made of bronze. Modern admirers say that the skills of the Shang bronze smith have never been surpassed. The Shang also used a wheeled, horse-drawn chariot in warfare. Chinese astronomers recorded all of the eclipses of the sun and moon. They also devised a 12-month calendar with 365 days and correctly identified the first day of each of the 4 seasons. Shang astronomers also kept records of rainfall and drought to predict the weather. Zhou dynasty. The Zhou royal family conquered the Shang dynasty and established their own dynasty that lasted more than 800 years. The Zhou rulers developed a new philosophy known as Mandate of Heaven. The Zhou rulers called themselves Sons of Heaven and claimed to be ruled by the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven meant that China's ruling families received their power to rule from the gods. A dynasty could rule only as long as it kept the mandate. The Zhou claimed that the Shang dynasty lost the Mandate of Heaven because they governed poorly. Every dynasty in China began when a powerful ruler defeated the last king of the old dynasty. The Chinese people believed that they had the right to overthrow their ruler if he did not rule wisely. The Mandate of Heaven became an important part of Chinese philosophy about government. Natural disasters and rebellions were thought to be signs that the gods were unhappy with the king's rule. Historians describe the pattern of the rise, decline, overthrow, and replacement of dynasties as the dynastic cycle. The dynastic cycle. After a period of time, the dynasty begins to decline. Government becomes corrupt, taxes are raised, natural disasters, invasions, and peasant revolt occurs. The ruling dynasty loses the Mandate of Heaven. Rival families struggle for power, rebellions and civil wars break out. The old dynasty is overthrown after much fighting and bloodshed. The new dynasty takes control of China. The new dynasty brings peace and order to China and claims to have the Mandate of Heaven. Feudalism and the time of the warring states. To control their newly conquered land, the Zhou king set up a system known as feudalism. The Zhou's empire was not a single kingdom. It was a collection of large estates. Under feudalism, land is subdivided and given to the nobility to use. In later centuries, feudalism also developed in Europe and Japan. In return, the nobles who are granted the land owe loyalty and military service to the king. They must also promise to protect the people who live on their land. The Zhou king and the feudal nobles promised to help one another during times of war and peace. Zhou kings had great power and ruled China for about 250 of the 800 years, after which the feudal lords exercised the real power and profited from the lands worked by peasants within their area. Over the course of time, local feudal nobles grew stronger than the king. As their towns grew into cities and their territories expanded, the political power of the Zhou kings declined. By 771 BC, feudal nobles had the real power in China, and the Zhou kings became powerless to control the noble families. Powerful warlords constantly fought among themselves for wealth and territory. This period of time in Zhou history became known as the Years of the Warring States. The Zhou dynasty became weak from the constant warfare. After many years of war among rival families, they were eventually conquered and ruled by a new dynasty known as the Qin. Fun facts. During the time of the Warring States, the military strategist Sun Tzu would write The Art of War. One of the core ideas presented in Tzu's Art of War is that to defeat your enemy, you must disrupt their harmony. This means that the enemy must be made unwilling to fight against you through psychological warfare. Sun Tzu believed that superior intelligence would overcome superior numbers and defeated the Chu army of 300,000 soldiers with just 30,000 soldiers under his command. The first books. The Chinese made important achievements during the Zhou dynasty. Under the Zhou, the Chinese made the first books, which were constructed of bound, thin strips of wood or bamboo. They carefully drew characters on the surface with a brush and ink. The earliest books usually were histories and religious works. The One Ching, or Book of Changes, is a handbook for diviners and is still used today to tell the future. The Book of Songs describes the lives of farming people, praises kings, and describes court ceremonies. The book also includes tender or sad love songs, with one describing a young woman's complaint to her family about forcing her into a marriage that she does not want. Silk making. During this period, the Chinese also built and improved roads for trade. China's cities became the center of trade, and merchants used metal coins as a way to trade for goods. The production of silk and other goods increased as trade grew through China. The Chinese cultivated silkworms and the mulberry trees on which they fed in order to boost their silk trade. They made silk from the cocoons of the silkworm and wove the silk threads into smooth cloth that was colored with brilliant dyes. Silk became China's most valuable export, and this led to an increase in foreign trade. The trade route that eventually linked China and the Middle East became known as the Silk Road. The Chinese kept the process of silk making a secret to protect this profitable trade. Metalwork and messengers on horseback. Other developments in the Zhou dynasty included the use of iron in making tools and weapons. The invention of the iron plow and development of irrigation and flood control systems was very important to farmers and helped China's growth. The Zhou dynasty continued making bronze ceremonial vessels, weapons, and armor. Metalsmiths also cast sets of large bronze bells to use in religious services. Nomadic tribes in the north taught the Zhou how to domesticate and ride horses. Soldiers rode on horseback instead of driving war chariots. Messengers on horseback could carry news through the empire faster than runners. Chinese philosophies. Confucius. Confucius was born during a time when the Zhou dynasty was experiencing constant fighting among the Chinese warlords. He was born to a noble but poor family and grew up to be a scholar, teacher, philosopher, and advisor to political leaders. Confucius believed that social order, harmony, and good government would improve Chinese society. He also taught the concept known as filial piety, respect for one's parents and family ancestors. Confucius put filial piety above all other duties, even loyalty to the state. His ethical code of conduct emphasized 5 basic relationships: ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, older brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. A code of conduct regulated each of these relationships. Rulers should rule wisely and fairly. Subjects should show respect for the law and loyalty to their leaders. Children should show respect to their parents and elders. In the first 4 relationships, the superior person was considered worthy of obedience and respect. In addition, the superior person was expected to set an example of moral and ethical code. Just as a father was responsible for the misdeeds of his children, so also was a ruler responsible for the actions of his officials. Confucius tried to teach his students how to become good public officials. He believed that education could transform a humbly born person into a gentleman. Confucian virtues of honesty, politeness, generosity, and loyalty were taught to those preparing for government service. Confucius's values became part of Chinese culture, and his idea had an important influence on Chinese history for centuries. Taoism. Laozi. Laozi was another great philosopher and teacher. He taught that for society to achieve happiness, the government should do as little as possible and leave people alone. Laozi believed that laws would not improve conditions and that people should be allowed to conduct their own affairs. Living passively and accepting your lot in life would lead to peace of mind. He is credited with writing The Way of Virtue, a book that had great influence in Chinese life. Laozi believed that a universal force known as Tao, meaning the way of nature, brought harmony to one's life. He believed that a universal force guiding all things and that people should live as simply as possible in harmony with nature. This philosophy became known as Taoism and later would grow into a polytheistic religion. Taoists had no interest in bringing order to human affairs as they sought to live in harmony with nature. Legalism, Hanfizi. Out of the teachings of another Chinese philosopher, Hanfizi, who died in 233 BC, came to a very different school of thought. Hanfizi believed that the nature of man is evil and goodness must be acquired. He insisted that the only way to achieve order was through strict laws and harsh punishments. Hanfizi's teachings were known as legalism. Legalists urged government leaders to use harsh rules as a means of ending social disorder and restoring peace and harmony. Legalism believes that a powerful government could maintain social order. They taught that rulers should reward the obedient and severely punish the disobedient. Punishment was the best means to maintain such social order. Followers of legalism also wanted to control what they believed to be dangerous ideas. Legalists wanted to strictly control the ideas of writers and thinkers, especially if they were critical of the government. These ideas were the official policy used by the dynasty that replaced Zhou, the Qin dynasty. Its ruler brought an end to the disorder that plagued the Zhou dynasty. What's next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. The URL citationmachine.net will assist you in creating citations.